Okay, let's dive right into this explainer and unpack exactly why the Elizabethan Age is celebrated as the absolute golden age of English literature. I want you to close your eyes for just a second. Imagine the muddy, bustling streets of 16th century London. You can almost smell the sharp scent of fresh ink. You're standing in a small island nation that is literally on the brink of an absolute creative explosion. Today, we're going to look at the historical forces, the major cultural shifts, and the flesh and blood geniuses that made this legendary era even possible. So, here is our roadmap for today. First, we'll define what this golden age actually is, then we'll unpack its three foundational pillars, explore the massive literary explosion that followed, and finally, we'll spotlight Shakespeare and his peers. All right, part one, the golden age defined. Let's set our timeline. Now, officially, the Elizabethan Age spans an uninterrupted window from 1558 to 1625. And what's interesting here is that while it's named after Queen Elizabeth I, it actually bleeds right over into the reign of King James I. This created a long, continuous era where the cultural and political conditions were just perfectly primed for a revolution in the arts. The scholar W.H. Hudson really hit the nail on the head when he talked about this period. He didn't mince words at all. He ranked it as one of the greatest in the annals of world literature, fueled by an unbelievable, and I'm quoting here, variety and splendor of its production. We aren't just talking about people printing a lot of books. We're talking about world-class masterpieces being churned out that literally set the foundation for how we tell stories today. Moving on to Section 2, the three pillars of the era. This is where we look at the perfect storm. Imagine being a writer alive during this exact moment in history. Ancient art is suddenly being rediscovered, the basic rules of your religion are being totally rewritten, and ships are constantly returning with wild tales of entirely new continents. It was a complete intellectual powder keg, and it was driven by three distinct pillars working simultaneously: the Renaissance, the Reformation, and this wave of intense patriotism and geographic discovery. First up, we've got the Renaissance. The word literally means rebirth, right? English writers suddenly became absolutely obsessed with the ancient masters of Greece and Rome. They're poring over classical tragedies and ancient philosophies, desperately trying to figure out how to elevate the raw, gritty English language of their time into a true, refined art form. And it became an absolute obsession. The poet Alexander Pope summed it up perfectly years later. Writers were basically told to make Homer's works their study and delight. Read them by day, meditate on them by night. It was just this relentless, round-the-clock pursuit of classical perfection. But here is the absolutely crucial distinction. These English writers were fiercely original. They were not just mere imitators. They took those classical blueprints, like using Homer for epics or Virgil for pastorals, and they built uniquely English, incredibly realistic castles out of them. They absorbed the lessons of the past, for sure, but they injected it with their own visceral, modern spirit. Okay, so alongside that classical rebirth flowed our second pillar, the Reformation. This movement was all about stripping away rigid dogma and those medieval superstitions. Suddenly, faith was much more about the individual. And this new intellectual freedom, it broke all the old chains and spilled directly onto the page, allowing authors to start exploring the gritty, realistic depths of the human condition without fear. And that brings us to the third pillar, a massive, booming sense of national pride. Just listen to this soaring verse from Shakespeare's Richard II. This sceptered isle, this seat of Mars. You can practically hear the fierce patriotism in those words, right? The nation was finally finding a loud, confident voice on the global stage, and its writers were acting as the main megaphone. Which naturally brings us to Section 3, the surprising literary explosion that followed. So, what happens when those three pillars collide? Boom! An absolute explosion of talent across every single genre. Look at this roster. You've got Edmund Spenser completely revolutionizing poetry with the Faerie Queene, Francis Bacon laying the actual groundwork for modern English prose, and Christopher Marlowe, who, fun fact, lived a highly dangerous double life as a government spy, pushing the dark psychological limits of drama with Dr. Faustus. The theater back then was literally a cutthroat battleground of genius. Heavyweights like Ben Jonson and John Webster were constantly trying to outwrite each other. They were penning these biting satires and incredibly dark, realistic psychological thrillers. They were pushing the absolute boundaries of what was legally and morally allowed to be shown to a live audience. And finally, Section 4, Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the towering figures of the era. Because, let's be honest, you really can't talk about this era without this guy. Notice how the name William Shakespeare just visually dominates this primary source catalog. It is an endless, spilling stream of comedies, histories, and tragedies. It's one thing to know he was prolific in theory, but actually seeing the catalog listed out like this, it really drives home his absolute dominance over the entire era. Let's actually put some numbers to that staggering output. 37. That is 37 complete plays. Just let that sink in for a second. 37 distinct, fully realized worlds, massive casts of flesh and blood characters, and incredibly intricate plots, all crafted by one single human mind. And then add to that an astonishing 154 sonnets. He wasn't just conquering the raucous, loud stage. He was mastering one of the most structurally unforgiving forms of poetry available at the time, exploring these raw, deeply personal themes of love, time, and human mortality. Oh, and we have to round it out with two massive narrative poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece. When you add it all up, his creative stamina becomes almost unimaginable. But within all those plays, the true heavy hitters are the masterpieces explicitly marked as tragedies. Romeo and Juliet, Macbeth, Hamlet, King Lear, Othello. These works didn't just entertain people on a Friday night, they fundamentally invented modern storytelling. Shakespeare gave us humans that felt shockingly real, flawed, ambitious, grieving, fiercely jealous. He set a standard for psychological depth that modern writers and filmmakers are quite literally still chasing today. And I just love this detail right here. Notice a little marginal note carefully marking The Tempest as his final play. It's such a beautifully fitting conclusion. It's a play entirely centered on magic, illusion, and ultimately an artist willingly giving up his craft. It serves as this perfect poetic bookend to an explosive, world-changing career. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. The Elizabethan Golden Age wasn't magic, right? It was the perfect storm of classical revival, new religious freedom, and soaring national pride. So think about this. When you look at the massive technological and cultural shifts happening in our own world right now, are the conditions ripe for a new golden age of storytelling? And if they are, who is going to be our era's Shakespeare? Thanks so much for joining me to explore this today.